Okie doke. Can you, okay. And then also share it to me on Slack since I'm actually not logged into Twitter on my machine. Toma, what is your official role title when I introduce you?
I'm the CEO of the Obel Association.
Opal Association. Got it. And Ben, I can enter you as CEO of Scopelift.
Yep.
Cool. Yana, head of strategy, Rary Foundation.
That checks
Got
out.
it. Good, good, good. Just wanted to do that. Or was it you're like Timex being like, it's live? Okay. All right, excellent. Let me just reshare it first on Twitter so that folks can see it. And then maybe let's just maybe tell me you can ask CHG to like blast all our Telegram channels as well. All right. So when should we start? Like, do we get confirmation if people are joining it, or is it more like it's just like simulcasted on Twitter, so we don't actually see those participants or listeners? Awesome. Awesome. Okay, great. All right. Awesome. Hello, welcome everyone. This is the Tally value accrual. I have a echo actually. Welcome everyone. Yeah, perfect. So this is the Tally value accrual panel that we're doing, webinar. We have here today an excellent team of folks to join with us and speak with us. We have the co-creators of the Tally protocol, Scopelift, CEO Ben DiFrancesco from Scopelift, Tomol, CEO of the Obel Association, and Yana Bertram, head of strategy at the Rary Foundation. So super excited to have everyone here. Welcome to our viewers in the audience and those who may be watching the recording of this. What we're going to do today is we're really going to dive deep into the topic of value accrual for protocols, right? And this is extremely important, especially today, but also for the future going forward for protocols, right? Today, tokens have become really a new paradigm on how organizations do things like capital allocation, distribution of governance power, ways of returning value to token holders. What we've seen in the past couple of years is the rise of tokenized organizations is really competing with the standardized methods of doing something like a C corporation or going public or these types of things, right? We're in this interesting moment where governance and tools around tokenization are opening up a really new and fertile ground to basically operate a new kind of organization, right? And that's things like protocols, things like infrastructure layers built in the Web3 space. So we've gathered these experts today to talk about this topic, to really go through it. We're going to do a little bit of a roundtable style, go through everyone and speak, hopefully take a few questions from the audience, and really talk about value accrual in general. Of course, we have a protocol now, the Tally protocol, which really dives into this by building a very secure module framework for building value accrual for tokenized organizations. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, but we can also be a little bit high level. So the format here is very open, very free flowing, and would be really excited for inbound questions. So I think we'll start off with why value accrual is necessary for protocols and tokens. And I would like to send this over to our esteemed panelists to help start to answer that. And maybe I'll start with Ben, I'll go in the order that I see folks on my screen. So maybe also as before we do that, maybe let's do a quick round of introductions. I introduce you folks, but I think it'd be useful to introduce yourselves and also talk a little bit about your project and, just give the audience a little bit of context. And then we'll jump into that first question of why value accrual is so necessary. So again, I'll start with Ben.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Ben DiFrancesco. I'm the CEO and lead engineer at Scopelift. We're a dev firm, dev agency, for lack of a better term, building in the Web3 space. We've been building smart contracts on Ethereum for many years now and have had the chance to work with a bunch of great projects. One of our focuses is on governance, DAO governance, on-chain organizations. But we do a bunch of other stuff, including in DeFi and the privacy space as well. And yeah, most recently, of course, we've had the pleasure of collaborating with Tally on building out large portion of the Tally protocol, which has a lot to do with staking value accrual for these orgs. And so excited to chat more about that.
Excellent. Next up, Yana.
Hi everyone, Yana Bertram, Head of Strategy at Rari Foundation. So we're a foundation that's towards the Rari DAO that governs Rarible Protocol and Rari Chain. So very much part of the NFT world and decentralized infrastructure that helps unlock use cases for NFTs. As part of my role, I essentially come up with ideas and then I oversee the execution of solutions that will help drive adoption of the Rari ecosystem. The role flexes quite heavily into governance as well, because our DAO is essentially the governing body for the ecosystem. So with that, we always explore ways of bringing more utility to the token and how to align incentives for governance participation.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you. And Toma.
Hey everybody, Toma here, CEO of the OBO Association, and I think a role fairly similar to you, Yana, there, trying to coordinate the ecosystem across different things. So OBO for us is the foundation for layer one that are trying to decentralize, and we've done that by pioneering decentralized validators, starting on Ethereum. We've expanded to Monad, to Gnosis Chain, securing about 1 to 2 billion of stake today, depending on the price of ETH. And part of my scope is also to take care of governance, which we recently launched with Tally a few months back. We've had a couple proposals pass, and it's been super fun going through this and learning more. So yeah, excited to see how governance and value accrual can play together actually rather than against each other.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you, folks. So, Toma, maybe let's jump in, get started with you. Why, in your opinion, is value accrual necessary?
So when I think about value accrual, my framework, I like to distinguish like three eras of value accrual sort of for tokens. So 2017 era, tokens were useless, no value accrual, just for crowdfunding, right? Then you have like the 2020 era, and there everyone was really scared about regulation and wanted to be sure they're not security tokens. So they tried to add like as much utility as they could in their tokens. And that's when you saw like the rise of these supply sinks, as they were called. So like artificial utility that would try to drive value to the token by people doing something with the token. I think a good example for that is, for example, Rocket Pool, that had this bond for running their node. And now I think that we're moving into the third era of tokens, which is the value accrual token. With the change of regulation, and we'll see what happens in the US in summer, but you see a lot of these protocols actually thinking a bit deeper in, okay, now it's actually maybe time to start doing this properly. There seems to be maybe a framework that we can use to give some of the value back to our users. And so it's really interesting to see how now protocols are moving away from these like artificial supply sinks and recognize that sometimes their token has actually nothing to do with their protocol. But that doesn't mean that that token can't represent the value that that protocol is creating. And that's all the conversation around fee switch and buybacks, etc., that you see happening, whether it's Maker, whether it's Aave, etc. I think a good question to probably ask the rest of you is whether we should start value accrual early in the project or reinvest in your growth, right? That's always the one that I'm wondering, like how early should you start?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll punt that then over to Yana and then Ben.
Yeah, it's I wish I had the answer, right? I think very much the stage in which the project is, I think, it's an indicator of like what feels like the right next move. But if you're at the beginning of your path, of course, it's a question to answer. I always tend to be more of a conservative player, and I feel like the DAO and the foundation and the treasuries that need to be in place need to be in a solid state of existence so that there's sufficient confidence for longevity of the operation. So because I'm at a foundation and my role is to be stewarding the DAO, for me, longevity of the operation kind of is like the upmost KPI, right? And how do we achieve that? Well, there needs to be several factors that are in place, right? Functioning governance is one, and therefore the incentive alignment that I was talking about. But treasury is really important, and the inflows of the treasury over time should be larger than the outflows of the treasury, right? So I think like if that's the rule of thumb, right? Now again, like with a conservative mindset, right? And it doesn't have to be like that at all the time, right? It doesn't have to be this 24/7, right? But on average, right? I think it's like it's a good rule of thumb to follow. Well, then how do I make sure that, the inflows are larger than the outflows? And if I'm exploring mechanisms of value accrual, then have I switched on as many levers as I can, essentially, right? And by I say I, right, like it's the community, right? Nothing is actually like a decision of one person because you're functioning in a centralized organization. So a lot of discussion, and I would be surprised if things like revenue sharing are the first kind of topics that a DAO would tackle, right? I think once you do invite this decentralized decision making in, I think that kind of like more conservative mindset around let's make sure that there's sufficient funding for the operation, right, might actually be the more dominant aspect that you will see emerge, right? Of course, it depends on the players you have in the DAO, but it's hard for me to imagine these like very risk appetite, like high risk appetite players essentially like stealing the stage, especially if you have a robust and well functioning governance, right? So in a way, like if your token is perceived as valuable, um, you will actually have a better governance as a result of that, right? Which then will ensure that the players are aligned with the longevity of the operation and therefore will be very prudent about things like revenue sharing. So I think it all actually ends up playing really well together. Um, and the question for me isn't so much like when should things happen, because you can have discussions with the DAO and you can see like, also what is the kind of like meta in the industry, right? Because a lot of the discussions that will be happening in the DAO are reflections of what is happening in the wider industry, right? So I think like you might be trying to time it, but it will be very much like a growth stage of the DAO rather than like a perfect timing on like a planner side, right? That's my perspective. But I think it's a constant dialogue, right? It's a constant dialogue with the DAO, with the delegates, with other people in the industry to see like what feels like a good next step forward.
Excellent. And Ben, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Jana said, which is that if you have value accruing to your token holders, you'll actually end up with better governance. And one of the aspects of better is more secure, right? Like it's not subject to governance attacks or extractive behavior from the participants or the token holders. And sometimes the line between what is an outright attack and what sort of extractive, negative sum or non-positive sum behavior is not super clear. But what is clear is that in the long run, if the protocol is securing and a large amount of value and generating a large amount of value for the treasury, then the token has to have value or the system is not secure, right? If you have $1 billion of value secured by a $10 million market cap token or something, right? To make an extreme example, clearly there's going to be some kind of problem that emerges here, whether it's an explicit attack or or, something less clear. So the number one reason that you need value accrual in the long run is the economic security of the protocol and the DAO that manages it, right? And so this also gives us a hint maybe as to how you think about when you turn on value accrual. You can look at what is the protocol securing and how much revenue does the protocol generate, and how does that compare to the value of the token itself, right? Because again, the reason to want the number go up isn't just because everybody wants to get rich or something. It's because that represents the economic security of the system that you're dealing with, of the DAO, of the protocol that the DAO is stewarding and protecting, right? And so you need that. And when DAOs launched originally, these tokens had a very large, what I would call speculative premium, right? People were willing to buy the token, so that the token had value because people were speculating on its future value. And at the same time, when a lot of the kind of OG DAO tokens came out, the protocols themselves were securing very little and had very little potential for revenue. And so you had small treasury, large token value due to the speculative premium. Okay, you're secure, the system's fine. Over time, what's happened is both of those things have gone in opposite directions. So the speculative premium on these tokens have come down over time. Lots of reasons for that. At the same time, for many of these DAOs, the thing that they're securing, the economic value that they secure and the revenue that they generate has gone up quite a bit. Like you have protocols doing real meaningful business on chain, so to speak. And so now what we're starting to see is these things are starting to line up, right? And so if you want these systems to remain secure, you need that economic security. And the way to do that is to drive value, return value to the token holders. So I think that's one of the reasons why this is in the meta right now, so to speak. There's so much conversation around this right now because it's becoming necessary really for the first time for a lot of the protocols that people know.
Can I ask a question here, Ben? Should we differentiate here in terms of security, whether actually the native token, let's say, that's accruing value as a place in the security of the system? Let's take, for example, Aave. There, it's like the insurance fund, or used to be the insurance fund. And so I think there your point is totally valid. But then I also heard a guy from Ethena last week saying they don't plan to turn revenue accrual, right? And I don't think Ethena's security is really defined by the ENA price or the value accrual that ENA does. They don't want to do any buybacks or anything like that. And that's probably because ENA is separate from what USD is doing today, right? And both can have like very different values. So, but that for me doesn't mean that ENA can't accrue value. Guy just thinks today that they can reinvest the money inside and drive like more value from speculation. So I think the security aspect is true, but only when the native token actually has a place in securing the protocol, as you say, which is true for like restaking or for like insurance, and when there is like a utility-driven place, right?
Yeah. I mean, yes, but also just basic governance, right? I mean, I don't know enough about the specifics of the protocol that you mentioned to comment on how that system is set up or how it works, right? But for many DAOs, the protocol is governed, so to speak. Like there are levers within the protocol that are controlled by the DAO, right? If it's an L2 DAO, it might be the ability to execute network upgrades is mediated through the DAO, right? Or mediated through the Security Council, which is elected by the DAO, so ultimately controlled and secured by the value of the token. Similar things for protocols that have fee switches, or the ability to whitelist certain assets, add or remove certain assets, etc. Right? So you can have mechanisms where the token backs an insurance fund or something like that, but even just basic governance itself is in a way security or control of the protocol. And so if it's easy to attack governance, if your governance has meaningful control over the protocol, which we should want, and we could talk about what the reasons are we should want that, but we should want that. And if you have that, then in the long run, you need value to the token, or your marginal token buyer becomes someone who is just trying to extract value from the protocol rather than contribute to its growth and positive sell outcomes.
Yeah, I think I would weigh in here also. I think right now we're in the period of a rediscovery of what tokens are and what they might mean. when we look at like the Zora token, which is being defined as a fund token, which is, very unclear what that actually means. We have meme tokens, and then we have these governance tokens, and they sort of are solidifying into these 2.5 different categories. I'm not sure yet if fun is going to actually become a category, but you have to think, if an organization is launching a fund token that does not have any control over the protocol, there's no governance rights, there's no revenue sharing, there's no value accrual, why launch that token, right? It could be a marketing thing, right? Like certainly there's a lot of value in terms of like marketing, but when we think about tokenized organizations of being these really valuable, sort of like new form of the corporation, whether decentralized or semi-decentralized, I think it's worth questioning whether or not those kinds of tokens are even kind of like part of the long-term vision of that, or maybe that's sort of like just a momentary blip. It certainly seems hard for me to imagine a world where we just have, Pepsi token that's just for fun, and there's just no reason to go through the hoops to like get Pepsi token, and you have like 10,000 other consumer brand fun tokens just for fun, right? That they actually don't do anything. And I think, in some ways the speculative premium in the ecosystem has gone down over the years because some version of that has actually happened, right? Like, pump.fun, I think is sort of the obvious sort of end state of it, where it's like the token actually means nothing. And then you sort of have to ask, like, besides like a marketing sort of stunt, once that sort of wears off, will that kind of token even really exist? And if we're thinking about the other kinds of tokens, or a token that somehow represents something that the organization cares about, then I think long term, if there isn't sort of collapse the speculative premium, which is eventually ends in zero, and if the organization somehow values it, there needs to be some sort of relationship between the organization and that token, whether it be governance or an insurance fund. I think the insurance fund is such an excellent example, right? Like you can earn some sort of revenue off the back of providing a insurance service to the protocol. I mean, that's such a brilliant example. Without going too deep on that, maybe I'll segue into a little bit. We're sort of talking about staking. Tally has built out a staking product that's very modular, can do a lot of different things. But there are other types of value accrual mechanisms that are kind of like being popular, talked about in the meta. One of them, sort of like the most popular one, is buyback and burn, right? Maybe some of you have some ideas or sort of like thoughts around how would you compare and contrast like the sort of like active participation form of value accrual around staking versus the more like passive form in something like buyback and burn? And maybe I'll start with Toma again.
Yeah, I think the buyback and burn is super interesting, and I'm still probably on the fence about it. The buyback and burn, I would definitely support more than just the buybacks, but I've seen recent DAO just do buybacks. I find that a bit scary, which for so many years, like this treasury have been trying to become more resilient and get away from this circular loop, right? Of your own token defining your own resilience. Sounds like Terra, right? Terra Luna. So I think it's kind of weird seeing some protocols just do simple buybacks again, even if sure they can sell these tokens later and beef up a bit their treasury. The buyback and burns make probably more sense if you have a lot of cash that you don't know how to reinvest. This is how you want to do value accrual. I think that makes sense. That's what Apple does today. It has proven to be like the most tax efficient as well, probably value accrual mechanism compared to dividends. So I think that's definitely a pro for these. To segue a bit then into the Tally staking, for me, I find the buyback and burn a bit like a rough instrument that comes from TradFi and maybe lacking a bit of the nuances and flexibility that the real internet and Web3 can bring with these tokens. So that's probably the part that I find a bit lacking on the simple buyback and burn, while staking offers that protection on governance and I don't know, paying delegates, which is something that I'm also looking at through the Tally protocol. So there is so much more things you can do besides the value accrual with the staking, and especially what you guys are building, that I think would be sad to pass on.
Yeah, and
Yana?
I think like the buyback and the buyback and burn, um, I kind of pretty much already know what part of the fence I'm sitting on. Personally, I'm not loving these concepts, and I'll explain why. So essentially, if I'm again thinking about like securing the longevity of the operation, like why does the token even exist in the first place? And I'm talking about governance tokens. Well, because a project at one point or a foundation at one point, depending on who it was at what year and so on, right? Like, and how compliant, given some to investors, given some to the DAO to manage as a treasury, given some to the team to pay off for the hard work they've put into creating the underlying technology. Um, and some to the community to reward them, right? And distribute the ownership of the token. Now, let's think about these different like token holder communities, right? What is it that they need, right? And the one thing that they have in common is like, if the token has a good value, everybody wins, right? The DAO treasury will be worth more and can translate into higher incentives for adoption of the technology, right? And the protocol that will generate more fees if the protocol is collecting fees, right? That will replenish the treasury. And then that income can meet other ends, whether reinvestment, buybacks, which I don't love, but okay, like it is on the table, right? Or staking rewards, or paying delegates in the non-native token, right? Like there are multiple ways you can then distribute that. But if you continue thinking about it from a business perspective, I would still need to see the actual case built out in support of buybacks. That it's not just the optimistic hope of my token will continue going up and somehow I will make more money on it if I resell at a later stage. Or in case of buyback and burn, this like almost academic approach of like supply demand, by restricting supply, the price must go up because now the demand doesn't meet as much supply, but it doesn't really account for like psychology, right? Which usually does kick in, and the buyback and burn usually don't have so much impact on the perceived value of the token that then translates into price. If anything, it's an inefficient investment vehicle, right? Because the connection isn't direct. The result isn't direct. Staking has a very direct relationship, right? The buyback and burn doesn't. So I think I'm personally looking for like what has the most direct relationship, not too many hoops and not too many potential barriers, right? That this idea needs to overcome for it to be successful. So I agree with you, Thomas. The incentivization of delegates is also really interesting, right? Because you do want people to be taking governance seriously, and it is an unrealistic expectation to think that somebody will be dedicating hours upon hours upon hours free of charge, right? Again, like that worked in the earlier days because we had that speculative nature of, or the speculative idea around the future value of a token. The same thing was happening in DAOs as well. This will lead to somewhere, right? Now you've been in a DAO for a couple of years, right? That somewhere should be happening now, right? And what is it going to be? And how am I going to get incentivized? So I think the staking mechanism makes me excited for not only the token holders, but potentially also delegates, depending like, if you want to have it go both ways, or other incentivization mechanisms for delegates as well.
Yeah, Yana, you make me think of how you mentioned a bit about like how these organizations create these tokens in the first place. And the idea, especially when you're looking for decentralization and that's the goal, or you're looking to distribute ownership so that the infrastructure feels credibly neutral, and therefore people are excited to build on it, it's almost a little counterintuitive to then say, And now our focus is going to try and minimize all that. Like we're going to just try and buy all the tokens back from the community and one by one buy out your share of participation. That actually, when you say it, put it like that, it kind of like clearly is counter to the idea, right? Like the organization should be working to get to the point where it survives off its revenue, not off of its speculative premium and the sort of like hope that you'll, because at the logical extreme of what you're talking about, the organization should buy back all the tokens and then resell them all again. And that actually, doesn't really make sense, because of the moment that the organization owns all those tokens, you've essentially, made it a centralized organization that's, very dangerous and at the whim of the foundation in this case. Ben,
Yeah,
oh yeah, Yana.
Yeah, sorry, just to build on that, or in case of buyback and burn, right? Then you essentially just switching on a mechanism of people exiting to community, right? It's like a different exit to community again, right? Where an entity is buying back the tokens, burning them so that some other entity can continue selling into the retail, right? So like conceptually, I don't love this idea, right? And I think the maybe harder path, but the more like honest path for any kind of business, right? It doesn't matter if it's DAO in Web3 or, some business in Web2 or, even like a very, proto business from 100,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, probably. The concept of, well, I actually need to do something that people want, right? And that will get me paid, right? That is what we should be focusing on, right? And using the treasuries in our native tokens to help drive the interest and drive the adoption of things that are useful, that will generate revenue, right? So I think, yes, it's really interesting to be thinking about the mechanisms of like value accrual for token that might offer an alternative path, right? But they should not work as a replacement for the original path, which is this protocol needs usage and it needs to be also perceived as valuable enough so that people pay for the usage.
Yeah. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys did a great job of discussing that. I agree with almost everything that was said. Maybe what I'll do is just like restate it in maybe more economic language, which is, buybacks and burns, buybacks or buyback and burn, those are useful mechanisms and they can have a lot of cases where they're useful. The question is, are they useful for DAO tokens, governance tokens? And I think the thing that it solves is it does create a value accrual mechanism. Now, I agree with some of the things that Yana said, like psychologically, is this actually a good mechanism? What are the results that we've seen in other places compared to, direct, like say a dividend style compensation? So that's one problem. But even if you put that aside and you say, okay, the buyback is going to generate value, is going to cause value accrual to the token, right? It doesn't solve the other half of the equation, which is the free rider problem, right? You talked about incentivizing people to do things, right? If when you do a buyback and burn, if it works, right, it's distributing the rewards, so to speak. Let's say you're using real protocol revenue to buy the token back and burn it, right? In theory, this could drive value to the token, but if that value is split evenly amongst every token holder, right? So a token holder who buys, who delegates to himself, who is on the forums, who participates in governance, who contributes, who writes code to help the DAO do something, he gets the exact same reward, per token held as someone who just buys it, sticks it in a cold wallet and forgets about it for years, right? And that is also not sustainable from an incentive perspective in the long run for these orgs to remain decentralized. Now, someone at some point, I forget who, mentioned that, say, like Apple does buyback, shares, and many other companies buy back shares. Those companies are subject to top-down, extrinsic, jurisdictions in the U.S., right? Enforcement of laws that ensure that they can't, simply do extractive behaviors, right? The stakeholders of Apple, if they were to just, like attack Apple and take all the value out of it for themselves, would be, arrested and go to jail, or at least, charged. So we have a top-down jurisdiction that enforces their behavior. Obviously, in Web3, if we're going to be permissionless, if we're going to be cross-border, cross-jurisdiction, if we're going to allow anyone to own these tokens and participate in governance, then we have to be resilient to that. We can't rely on that, right? And so what that means is we have to set up our incentives properly. And so for me, that means value accrual mechanisms shouldn't just be value accrual across the board. If you want to solve this free rider problem, you have to return value to people who participate in the DAO or provide services to the protocol in some kind of values aligned positive sum way, right? In a sense, it's kind of like, Toma, you mentioned earlier how there was a certain era of tokens where people were sort of contriving utility for the token in all these ways, rather than to try to create token sinks rather than actually returning value. I think where we come to is something that actually properly blends the two things together, right? Owning the token should result in value being returned to you if you also use the token to perform and provide services to the DAO, including properly aligned governance services. That could mean delegation, it could mean active participation, in which case I think you should get compensated more. But the token kind of is both at the same time, right? It has the utility of allowing you, enabling you to perform these services to the DAO, and then it rewards you for them, right? And if we can get that right, if we can tune the incentives right there, I think we can actually have organizations that work, right? That are functional, that drive their protocols and projects forward, but at the same time are permissionless and cross-border and censorship resistant, and anyone can enter and exit at will. And I think that's what a lot of us at least want us to be aiming for in the long run.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great addition to that. Restating in economic terms is very, very clear. I think that the free rider problem is something we should think very deeply about, because these protocols are very different. They're similar to companies, but they're very different. And the big differentiator is that actually the participants of these ecosystems are very important to the protocols and the ecosystems themselves, which is a little bit different than something like Apple, right? If all the Apple shareholders were to suddenly disappear, Tim Cook would just continue to operate Apple. And, that's very different than something like, a lending protocol where if all the, token holders disappeared, it couldn't launch new updates, it couldn't patch security vulnerabilities, it couldn't add new markets or adjust the collateralization ratios. You could certainly argue that you could have a Tim Cook of a lending protocol, but then the net result would be that over time, participants wouldn't build on this infrastructure because they would be at the whim of Tim Cook, much the way that developers today are at the whim of Apple, right? Like, you have no choice but to accept the 30%, tax on the Apple Store. You have no choice to deal with, at times it can be perceived as capricious decision-making on how they implement policies. So, and that doesn't work when we talk about building infrastructure layers like L2s or lending protocols or stablecoins, where, you can't reliably build $1 billion business on top of the decision making that is made by someone that you don't have any influence over.
Yeah, no, this is really good. I'm sorry to jump back in here, Denison, but I think this is such an important point. Obviously Apple is a hugely successful company, and obviously iOS is a hugely successful platform. But I actually spent quite a few years as an iOS developer, and one of the things that you talk about in that community is this concept of getting Sherlocked, right? So you mentioned the 30% fee. That's something that you're subject to, but also throughout the history of Apple's platforms, going back to the Mac and well into iOS, every time an app really takes off, like some third party develops an app, ships it to the store, it's a big hit, lots of users, generating revenue. In the long run, what ends up happening is Apple creates their own version of that thing and bundles it in with the platform, and usually kills or greatly hampers the third party developed version of it, right? Because if there's some app that is really valuable for many, many users, like this is a logical thing for Apple to do. they want to drive value to themselves, right? Not to their platform, to their devices in this case, right? They're only worried about third-party developers in as much as it helps them do that, right? And so this is a term in technology. It's called platform risk, right? Like the classic example that people always bring up is Zynga, right? Which built a whole business on top of Facebook and then got nerfed. But you could talk about, people that built on top of the Twitter APIs, even people that try to build businesses on top of, things like Amazon, selling, right? Like that's why Shopify has been successful, right? Because in certain ways it neutralizes platform risk. Even like the web itself was successful as a platform for applications because all the existing platforms were proprietary and came with this huge platform risk, right? The web, like everybody takes for granted today that SaaS, apps run on the web. But actually there was like, it's not what the web was built for originally. Like the web was built for text and documents. The reason why it got shoehorned into acting as a, platform for applications to be built on was because the proprietary existing platforms that existed, in Windows and in other, proprietary operating systems way back in the day. Now I'm dating myself. Those were too risky to build on, and so people wanted the web, just like by accidents of history, became this sort of permissionless platform that anybody could build on, and so it became the one where everybody built their products, right? And so this is just a really important point, which is what Web3 allows us to do is sort of like cut this Gordian knot where on the one hand, obviously a company that's building a platform has to or wants to, or all the incentives are going to push it in the long run to doing what's best for it in a narrow sense. But that in turn limits the ability of third parties to build with confidence on top of those platforms. And there's always been this tension. And now we can sort of have our cake and eat it too, or we can use, the mechanisms that Web3 gives us to strike this balance where you can have something that is, kind of community owned, permissionless, and therefore mitigates this platform risk, right? Can be credibly neutral in a way as a piece of infrastructure that an owned platform, a centrally controlled platform never could be. At the same time, that thing can be dynamic and it can evolve and it can grow and it can adapt to the market because it's controlled by this distributed group of stakeholders and participants who have come together and opted into, driving this thing forward. So, I know a lot of people have gotten cynical about DAOs and whatnot, but I mean, that vision still excites me. And for all the problems that we have, I do think we're iterating our way toward that, right? And I think it would be a mistake to give up on it. I think there's a lot of promise to it, and we're putting in place the building blocks that make it possible.
Here. Yeah, that's a great point. The platform risk is something that, we could probably do a whole another webinar on, but you could certainly imagine in a world, where there's some staker on Obol that does so well and, Obol could get jealous and take the business, or some NFT platform on Rary chain could be so successful that Rary decides, hey, we'll just build that natively into our chain itself and take your business for ourselves, right? And that's the danger that all these protocols pose if there isn't decentralization. Switching gears just a little bit, we don't have so much time left. We do have some questions, but I do want to get a chance to hear a little bit from Thomas and Jana, both about how their organizations are thinking about staking. Both Rary and Obol have committed to some form of staking roadmap. Maybe starting with Thomas, maybe you could talk a little bit about why Obol has chosen staking, what is staked Obol, and, Jana, then you could talk a little bit about the Rary Foundation's perspective. And then we'll try and get to, if no one has a hard stop, try and get to a couple questions that are in the chat. So to the listeners out there, if you have more questions, now's your time to put them in the chat. And then Thomas, start with you, and then Jana.
Cool. To be honest, it was a super easy decision for me, and the governance passed as well with, I think, 90+% support that they wanted to have staking. And I think the reason for that is it breaks a lot of the trade-offs and the modular architecture that the Tally protocol offers. It's just like, there's just so many benefits. We've talked a lot about today in terms of value accrual. I think that's one thing that Obo will definitely look to do one day. I don't know if that's today. We still want to accrue more revenue. I think, Yana, you made a good point. Let's be profitable first, and then maybe we can start distributing things. So, but still, that's an amazing building block to already have ready, right? And then now we don't have to worry about governance versus DeFi. That's also amazing, right? Like I'm looking into how can we deploy, for example, a Morphovault for staked Obo, and instead of having that governance power that's just lost in the void of that Morphovault, now it's auto-delegated into a smart strategy, so that the protocol doesn't get at risk, as you were saying earlier, Ben. So governance versus DeFi, value accrual. And then we can start talking about how does the staking rate can also be used to pay for the delegates, which I agree should definitely be incentivized for the work they're doing. So just that is already like 3 completely different features that I was interested in building anyway, and the Tally protocol bundles them all together in a nice way. And I think that's such a change of paradigm of how you can really build value by creating synergies between systems that are modular and integrated well together, that it was just like a no-brainer for us. So in the phase 1 of staking for Obo, I think that will go live when we unlock the token for TG. That's going to be very soon for the ones that are waiting that. And yeah, people will be able to unlock and stake their token, get ST Obo in return. That will accrue some staking rewards. And stage 2, we're looking at enabling that compensation for delegates and more things, and at some point value accrual. But it's just great to already have the building blocks in place to be able to do these things in the future.
Awesome. Super excited. Yana.
So we have an older token that the DAO governs. I believe it launched in July 2020. And it already saw a heyday during NFT summer in 2021. So the challenge of our value accrual and our ecosystems support, treasury longevity, right? It's a question of relevance, and it's a question of continue delivering on this value, right? From different angles, because the NFT marketplace that uses the protocol Rarible has been around for quite some time, right? And yes, there are new upgrades and exciting things happening with Rarible and the new marketplaces they built and all of that. So the ecosystem is definitely not stagnant. We also launched Rari Chain over a year ago. So we have good news happening, right? But we can't limit ourselves to just this. So when Tally announced staking last summer, I think it was, that the news came out, we immediately raised our hands up as let's explore this together. Once it reached the DAO as a discussion, the delegates were overwhelmingly in favor as well. I think it is, for us, the DAO instituted fee switch on the protocol not so long ago, and because of our governance roadmap, the protocol is multi-chain, but the fee collection was just on mainnet, and it's just now moving to multi-chain. So the revenue potential wasn't fully there in terms of practice. It will be, but the DAO still needs to get a good grip at how much revenue it will be generating. So now there's actually this intermediary step, and the proposal is now being discussed in forum, where the delegates proposed a budget as a flat amount for a period, and then running the staking in stages in different seasons with the rewards just going a little bit down. And this is part of, just setting this up, and also part of a wider governance upgrade roadmap. Our token also was issued with a vEscrow model, which is not compatible with a lot of new practices that we have seen in governance over the past few years. So we have upgraded to a custom L2 token. So we are also using the staking as an incentive for people to upgrade to this new version of the token. So it just fits together in our larger governance upgrade roadmap. And it will accrue value for the token as well. So I think like for us, this is like a really good moment as an ecosystem to be pursuing staking. And on the delegate incentive side, I think, this is a much richer territory, right? How to establish delegate incentivization in a way that is fair, that is transparent, right? And that incentivizes the right kind of behavior in the DAO. And it's a bit of a longer discussion. So for us, that is not necessarily part of the staking today, but it could be part of staking tomorrow.
Awesome. Great to hear. I'm really excited for both of your folks' implementations. We have a couple questions in the last couple minutes here. The first is, in terms of staking, is the risk of slashing or forfeiture of stake a necessary requirement? I'll punt that over to Ben.
So I think it depends on the kind of staking that is being performed, right? So for the way that I have started to think about this, and these are weakly held ideas, but I think governance staking is sort of like, for a DAO token, like a base level of a staking, right? So if you want to be if you want to get any value returned to you, at a minimum, what you need to do is delegate the tokens that you hold to someone who is actively participating in governance in a values aligned way, right? And in that situation, I don't see slashing as a requirement for staking, right? But loss of rewards might be. In other words, if your delegate, the person that you're delegating to, ceases to be active, or does something, basically ceases to be active, to be participating in governance, right? That you could lose the rewards that are being accrued to you, right? But I don't see a strong reason why governance staking would need to result in slashing of your underlying funds. Now, on the flip side, if you are using something like let's say Uniswap, for example, they've announced recently that Uni is going to be used for staking to help secure the UVN, the Uniswap Validator Network for Unichain, right? I think what they've said is, in the long run, maybe not at launch, but in the long run, they intend to slash operators who misbehave in some way, similar to staking to secure ETH, obviously with different kinds of properties, given that it's an L2. Something like that, where there's like a kind of misbehaving, it shouldn't just be loss of rewards, it should be risk of your underlying funds. And then an interesting question on top of that is whether these different kinds of staking to provide different kinds of services to the DAO should compose with each other or be separate, right? So Uniswap has said, and is exploring, at least, I don't think this is official, but they're exploring allowing the UVN to integrate with the underlying Unistaker instance so that you can delegate to governance and receive rewards there, and delegate to an operator and receive rewards there as well, while also, in the latter case, putting your funds at risk of slashing if you misbehave, right? So you can kind of choose which risk reward profile you want to partake in, and maybe also even compose the two together, which I think is interesting. So really long-winded way of saying, no, I don't think it's necessary. It depends on what you're doing with the staking.
But it can be done, right? Can I add a third option to your set of options?
Yeah.
There? And I think that's the restaking one. With the advent of restaking, actually, if you wanted to, you can take your stake tokens, let's say staked OBOL, deposit that into an Eigenlayer or Symbiotic, and that secures like an extra AVS that can do something for the protocol. Like we were looking into how can we do that insurance funds. I really wanted to do that. Well, actually, you don't want to necessarily force everyone to be in that insurance fund, as you were saying earlier, Denison. So you don't want to force all the stakers to be part of it, but the restakers could be part of it. So they could take the STO, deposit it to Symbiotic, and then get extra yield, right? So everyone kind of forgot about restaking, but I think that's the nice option and the modularity of DeFi here. Like you can add restaking very easily if you want to.
Yeah, fully agree.
And also, like,
that makes total
from
sense.
Like the governance or like stake for governance perspective, I would shy away from any kind of penalization, because what we're trying to do essentially is to make people participate. And these are people and token holders that are not participating. Their tokens are, in governance perspective, sitting idle, unutilized, right? And we're trying to motivate them to make the tokens active in governance by delegating them. So any kind of like penalization might actually have the opposite effect, right? So we're trying to motivate, not scare. So I think like just from this perspective, any kind of penalization, I don't think that has place. And to Ben's point, the loss of your benefit is the penalty.
Yeah, and maybe something I'm hearing as well is that there's kind of the tally stacks. I'm sort of like promoting that here. There's actually a real modularity and composability here, right? Like if you are interested in staking for governance and that's your sort of comfort level and your sort of goal, you can do that. But an obol, you can take now your staked obol, and there may be more opportunities to earn more rewards or more yield by solving other different use cases that the protocol has, right? In this case, you could take it and put into restaking. So you can start to imagine that you have this actually very composable structure of how you can reuse and drive value back to these tokens. Whether, do you want Toma, you mentioned you shouldn't force people into the insurance fund, right? But the insurance fund can be a nice add-on for those with that sort of like risk appetite, right? And again, that echoes actually Ben's point around the free rider problem, where you sort of like distribute rewards to everyone. The sort of like net effect per each individual unit is quite low. Well, not everyone's going to stake in the first place. So you start to concentrate that in the sort of like active participants of your system. Not everyone from that, subset of stakers is going to also be willing to take the risk of, backing an insurance fund. So now the rewards for the insurance fund are compounded even more for that smaller subset. So you actually can find probably a really strong stasis where there is some sort of, basket of services that you can provide with your token back to the protocol that sort of match your sort of like risk profile, your sophistication, or your tooling, that actually is very hyper efficient in terms of returning that value, right? We don't want all that sort of value that could be compounded for the insurance fund people or the governance staker people to just being distributed to, a cold wallet that has sat dormant for many years and actually hasn't provided any value, right? So you can sort of imagine laddering this up. There's some other protocols that have talked about ideas about being able to borrow that staked asset to provide liquidity to protocols that use it, and they have to pay for that. And again, you take the sort of risk on the liquidity, but you are providing some additional net value. So there's a lot of like composable things that you can do here, which could allow protocols to really build a system that works for them. We are right up about time here. Just 2 minutes left in the hour. I want to thank everyone for having joined the panel today, our viewers as well. I hope this has been very informative. It is recorded, so it will be available. Are there any final comments that anyone wants to share here before we go off the air?
Well, thanks for
Just
initiating.
say thank you.
Yes, same thoughts, Ben. Yeah, thanks for initiating discussion. I think it's very timely. A lot of projects are either launching tokens or working with their existing tokens, and there's more to come. So I think this theme of value accrual is a pertinent one for almost all projects in crypto at this point. So thank you for helping bring us together to discuss.
Ben?
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, fully agree. I'll just want to say thank you again for organizing this, and I guess my final statement would just be, I know that the signal to noise ratio in crypto is really poor, right? There's so much going on. As you can tell by my balding head and ever-growing beard, I've been around for a while, and despite all the noise, I think I have the perspective to say that like real progress is being made. Like underneath all the nonsense, there is real stuff being built. I'm still very confident of that, and certainly Tally is amongst the people doing that, and I've appreciated the opportunity to collaborate. Jana and Toma, you guys are working on projects that are similarly building real things, and appreciate that. And so I would just, I think everybody's a little bit burnt out. Maybe that's just my crypto Twitter feed, I'm not sure. But I am still very optimistic in the long run, and I see real things being created, and I'm excited to contribute to them.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. If you in the audience are looking to get started with value accrual, working with the Tally modular stack, whether that be growing, launching, or operating your protocol, as well as the value accrual, please reach out, tally.xyz/contact. We would love to speak with you. We have a whole suite of tools that are directly designed to help you build, launch, and operate your organization from, you know, 1 or 2 participants to hundreds of thousands and billions of dollars. So if that is something you might be interested in, reach out. We would be happy to chat. Ben, Yana, Toma, thank you once again for being great, participants here in our panel. It has been a pleasure speaking with you, and yeah, thank you to the viewers.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.